inviting us to come present this work to you. This has definitely been something we've been working on for quite a few years now, so it's very exciting to be actually be able to have some results to share with everyone. And so really the plan for today was to go through kind of our project. And what we sort of titled it as the adaptation and validation of the ACMG and AMP variant classification framework for MYH7 associated inherited cardiomyopathies. And for any of you who are at the NSGC pre-con a couple weeks ago, I apologize. This will be a bit of a refresher for you. So to start off, really the plan for just going through this talk is to give you a little bit of background on how we assessed the initial question, and then really take you through the process we used, some of the adjustments that we actually made to the rules, how we actually tested those rules through variant selection, curation, and review, and then go through some of our results and some of our initial conclusions at this point. So what we really first decided to approach this topic, we did what we called a variant bake-off. And we really wanted to try and get a sense of, well, how much adjustment do these rules really need? I think, we had our hunches, but we really wanted to try and sort of quantify that a little bit. And so what we did was take 10 MYH7 variants that are fairly well reported, so we assumed that multiple people would have experience with them. And we did two types of reviews. Essentially, we first looked at the ACMG classification framework as it stood with no sort of guidance, and then used internal classification that various institutions that our members belong to had for classifying these variants. And so we had 3 experts go through both of these types of reviews. And essentially what you'll see is that when we used just the ACMG rules without really much guidance, we were actually quite discordant on the ultimate classifications that we ended up with. We were only concordant on 3 out of the 10. But when we used our own internal classifications, we were much more concordant, and we really only had 1 variant that ended up being discordant. And that really just supported what I think we already knew, that the ACMG framework was a really good starting point, but there was a lot of room for interpretation. And so it became challenging to know, when do you apply certain things in certain cases. And it was actually really reassuring to us that when we used our internal classification, that ultimately we were concordant. And that really showed that using cardiomyopathy or gene-specific information does actually allow us to get to more consistent classification. And so that was really a sort of helpful proof of concept for us. And so quickly, the highlight of sort of the project that we sort of grouped into phases. And essentially, phase 1 was reviewing the original framework and coming up with draft modification specifications for that. Then the next phase was really then testing the rules. So picking a group of variants, going through them, reviewing them, and comparing our assessment of them and seeing how well did the rules work. Based on that, there were some final adjustments that needed to be made to the rules, and ultimately, because we wanted the result of this to be something that would be beneficial to the community, all of these variants that were assessed as part of this process have been submitted into ClinVar with an expert panel status. So to take you through some of the types of adjustments that we made, they really fell into 4 main buckets. The first being disease and gene-specific adjustments, some of which I'll go through shortly. And then also we found that some of the rules, the application of strength actually needed to be adjusted a little bit, and I'll touch base on those as well. And then, as is probably not surprising, some of the rules were just not applicable, either due to the inheritance model or what is known about that gene. So for MYH7, we know that loss of function is not an established mechanism for cardiomyopathy. Therefore, applying the PVS1 is not really applicable. So that's not a rule we would use for this gene. And then some of the rules were good as they standard and didn't really need any additional changes. So one of the first groups of rules that we tackled were those that were really focused on minor allele frequency. So as some of you might be familiar, BA1 is a standalone criteria that is used to classify a variant as benign. The original framework sets the threshold at 5%. And ultimately for this, what we know about this gene and what we know about cardiomyopathy, we just felt this was just way too high. So we came up with an approach that used conservative estimates of disease prevalence, penetrance, and gene contribution, and those are listed on the screen. And ultimately, and the equations listed as there as well, and ultimately that resulted in a threshold of 0.1%. And essentially a way to think about this is that a variant that is seen at this frequency could theoretically be pathogenic only under the assumption that it is the only pathogenic variant. And so that we know is obviously not the case for this gene, and so we felt comfortable using that. In addition, if you think about the larger populations that we're using, we also have to recognize that minor allele frequency estimates, are just that, they're estimates. And so to account for when you have rare variants in small populations, we also apply the statistical correction, in this case a 95% Poisson distribution. For BS1, and that's the rule that when an allele frequency is too high for the disease, we used a similar approach, but this time we actually factored in allelic heterogeneity. And in this case, we jumped more towards grouping cardiomyopathy, or in particular HCM, because it's the most common altogether. And when we use that, the maximum pathogenic variant contribution replaces the gene contribution, and that resulted in a threshold of 0.02%. A way to think of this is that a variant at this frequency can be safely assumed to be likely benign, since its threshold is equal to the theoretical population frequency of the most common pathogenic variant. And since we know what that most common pathogenic variant is, we would expect everything else to be below that. Ultimately, we also used a similar approach for PM2, and that's when a variant is absent in a large population studies, because we do know that there's always sometimes a small number of these alleles in those large populations for this group of disorders. And this approach used more realistic values for prevalence and penetrance to define an acceptable frequency at which this rule can be applied when there are alleles in that population, and that threshold is 0.004%. Another rule that we wanted to look at was functional studies. And in the original framework, functional data is really only weighted as strong evidence. And so the main question for our group at this point was, what studies are actually acceptable to be considered as strong evidence? Obviously, there's a wide range of studies that are out there, but what really is going to give us the specificity and sensitivity to really label it as strong? And that was really sort of the key for us, high specificity and high sensitivity. And ultimately, after reviewing the available studies that are out there for MYH7, our group decided that only mammalian variant-specific knock-in models are acceptable to be considered as strong evidence. The challenge being that other in vivo models that alter gene dosage are just not variant-specific. And so it's really felt that these types of models, as well as other traditionally available in vitro studies, are just not sufficient at the moment to be considered strong evidence, though we definitely recognize that over time, new studies may come up that would then fit in this bucket. But for right now, only mammalian variant-specific knock-in models are what we would consider acceptable. We also knew that incorporating protein domains was an important piece of one of the rules. And currently, the framework as it stands provides moderate weight for variants that are located in a functionally important protein domain. But that needs to be defined, obviously, per gene. And so for MYH7, it has been previously reported that pathogenic variants in MYH7 are primarily found within the head domain and less so in the rod or tail domain. And recent studies have shown that there's a statistically significant clustering of pathogenic variants between codons 181 and 937. And so after reviewing all of this information, our group felt that we could apply this moderate rule PM1 when a missense variant was located within this particular region. The likelihood of it being pathogenic, purely based on location, was strong enough to warrant moderate weight. And then, so those other rules were primarily more disease and gene specific. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about some of the rules, we felt that the strengths really had to be modified a bit. So as part of our review of the initial framework, we noted that in the segregation rule was one where it allowed for increasing weight, but there wasn't really guidance on what thresholds to use or what number, what evidence do you put into a supporting bucket versus what evidence do you put into a strong bucket. And so we set out to really try and define that a little bit more. So segregation, as you know, is really only defined as a supporting rule. And so we decided to define our levels, and we used autosomal dominant likelihood ratios of 10, 30, and 100, which ultimately resulted in cutoffs of 3, 5, and 7 myoses for this. And this was definitely taking into account that the fact that these genes are, have reduced penetrance and variability. Additionally, the original framework requires that segregation should be occurring in 2 or more families due to the possibility of linkage disequilibrium. But we ultimately felt that this was overly stringent, given that MYH7 and cardiomyopathy is such a well-established disease gene association. But it is something that really should be kept in mind when you're thinking about newer genes. Having segregation in multiple families definitely provides stronger evidence. Similarly, we felt that there was the same issue for probands. So we noted the original framework used proband data really only assigned for strong weight, and that was for case control studies that showed a statistically significant increase in probands compared to controls. But we know that large case control studies for MYH7, as they are for many other genes, are rare. And so we ultimately wanted to be able to use the number of times in the current variances found in the proband as supporting evidence, as I think we all know intuitively. So we developed an approach to incorporate multiple probands across different studies using exact as sort of a proxy for healthy controls. So almost sort of a quasi-case control study. We applied the same likelihood ratios, and this resulted in cutoffs of 2, 6, and 15 probands for the respective weights. And we definitely recognize that this approach has limitations, including the fact that we are assuming that exact is a suitable control population, which everyone knows it's not perfect. And it also does not account for heterogeneity across cohorts or separate studies. But we felt that this was still a valid approach because these limitations were really balanced by choosing very stringent parameters and the general nature of the ACMG framework in and of itself, which requires evidence from multiple types of data to really elevate a variant into a clinically significant status. And so this is just a nice visual of the rules that were applicable to MYH7 and the types of adjustments we made. So there were 12 rules that ultimately had disease or gene-specific adjustments, 7 that were in the pathogenic spectrum, 5 that were in the benign spectrum. We had 5 that we sort of added different weights to those rules. There were 7 that had no change to them, and then the ones that were not applicable are listed there as well. And ultimately what we wanted to end up with was a couple different documents that really allowed people to hopefully apply these criteria somewhat easily. So we ended up with a nice large table that has an abbreviated version of the adjustments to the rules, the type of changes that we made to each rule, as well as a sort of a little cheat sheet in terms of how to combine the different groups of evidence that is all the way on the right, and obviously this is a very abbreviated version of that table since it would not fit completely on the slide. But the other thing that we really wanted to provide people was a more detailed rule. And so we have a separate rule file that goes into much more detail for each of these rules. And part of that being some of these things are, I think, well assumed by people who do cardiomyopathy variant interpretation all the time or know this gene very well. But we definitely recognize that that is not the case, and we want this to be applicable to people who aren't as familiar. And so for some of these rules, it was just really about providing more guidance. And so this is just one example, and for a de novo rule, but we wanted to make sure, I think it's sort of safe to assume that de novo means parents don't have the variant, but we wanted to be obvious about that. And also for other genes, absence of other possible causes of disease. We know with cardiomyopathy, sometimes people can have multiple variants that are contributing, and so that needed to be taken into account. But then really, I think what is more challenging with a gene and group of diseases like MYH7 and cardiomyopathy is that absent family history is not always straightforward. For more syndromic cases, that's a little more clear, but we actually felt like we needed to clarify sort of what constitutes a no family history and versus what should be concerning and maybe not apply. So we really tried to spell that out, and I'm obviously not going to go through all these in details, but wanted to give you guys an example of the level of detail that we tried to provide for some of these rules to hopefully make this something that people who don't have a lot of experience with this gene or disease could use and go forward. So that was really, the adjustments we made to the rules. And so jumping into the next couple phases was we decided now that we've made these adjustments, we need to test them. We've got to see how well they actually work. So we essentially selected 60 variants to pilot these adjustments. Every variant was initially curated, and then it was reviewed by 2 experts, one with clinical experience and one with laboratory experience. Ultimately, we compared the initial assessment and classification between those reviewers. We had to go through and do some data cleanup, and ultimately this review had us adjust a few rules at the end. So in terms of variant selection, we chose 60 variants, and we really wanted them to be representative of the type of variants that we see for MYH7. So the vast majority were missense variants. It's the primary variant that we know to cause disease, but we wanted to include other types. We ultimately wanted to test as many rules as possible, so we looked to see as best we could what variants had literature available for them, which variants had known segregation, de novo occurrence, those sorts of things, to try and test as many of those rules. We also wanted to cover a range of classifications. So the bulk of the variants we selected at the time were classified as pathogenic, likely pathogenic, or VUS. But we obviously don't want to leave the benign spectrum out, so we made sure to include some variants for that as well. And ultimately, because we wanted the end product of this to be something that would be of benefit to the community, we also chose variants because they were discrepant in ClinVar, and hopefully this review would help clarify that a bit. And this is just the schematic of the number of variants and their ClinVar assessment. So, about a third were concordant, but then ultimately about a third, or actually almost half, were discordant in some degree. The vast majority were either a step up from VUS, but there was actually one variant that was discordant in a couple labs between the pathogenic spectrum and likely benign. So to try and figure out, well, did we use the rules that we were hoping to, and did we test all the rules? This shows you the 25 rules that were applicable for MYH7, and we used 21 of them. Obviously, again, leaning towards the pathogenic spectrum because of the variants that we had selected. And we were happy to see that we essentially used most of the rules more than once. And the 4 rules that you'll note with the stars that were used the most were not too surprising. PS4 is having to do with a strong proband count, or case control data. PM1 is that variant located in the head domain. PM2 is absent in large populations, and then PP3 is computational evidence. So obviously those are types of evidence that are available for most of these variants, so it's not too surprising that those were used in the vast majority of cases. But it was good to see that we had a good representative use across most of the rules. One of the other things that we found when we were reviewing the data is the impact that internal laboratory data had to the rules and the overall count. So when available throughout this process, we reviewed the internal laboratory data from several of the working group members that was currently unpublished at the time the variants were curated. And so we really wanted to look and see, well, what impact did that actually have? And you can see the figure that you guys are looking at shows 8 variants, and the dark blue is essentially the publicly available data, primarily from the literature. And then the lighter blue teal color is the additional number of probands that was added for each of those variants based on internal data, so data that was available through our collaborations for them. And you can just visually see that it made a difference. But ultimately, for 25 of these variants, internal data that we had related to either proband segregations or de novo occurrences impacted the strength for at least one of those rules. So for 25 variants, internal data impacted one of those rules. And ultimately, it impacted the final classification of 12 variants. And so in that case, it was 7 that were upgraded from likely path to pathogenic, and another 5 that increased from VUS to likely pathogenic purely based on incorporating the internal data with the public data. And obviously, this is not a new concept, but for us, it was just a powerful demonstration of the impact that this traditionally, separate private data and how it really is. We really need to share this data, and in doing so, it's really going to provide us with the most accurate and up-to-date classifications for these variants. And so I don't think we're too surprised by this, but we're a little bit surprised by the power of it. Then the last thing, or one of the last things, was really looking at how did our reviews compare between our reviewers? Because obviously, we want to make sure that even though these rules are being used by different people, that ultimately they are being classified the same way. And so if we look at the 60 variants that we had, initially we were concordant on the majority of them, but there were 8 that were discordant between reviewers after this sort of initial classification. So we went in and we looked at exactly what those classifications were, what rules were used, why were there differences, and we found that for 4 of them, it really was mostly just errors. And so that was more that, even though we were looking at the same data, someone counted 5 segregations and someone counted 4. And in that case, that would change the rules that were ultimately used and therefore could change the ultimate classification. So when we corrected for that, those were no longer discordant, and ultimately we found that there was sort of a 93% concordance rate in between our reviewers. But when we dug into those, we also found that it was really, those were discordant more because of what we call rule misuse. And really that ultimately digging into it, a rule that was applied that really should not have been applied, or alternatively, someone did not apply a rule that really should have been applied. And so this really showed us that this process can be error prone. And it's a complex process to look at data and to apply all these rules. And so that's something that needs to be factored in to this process. And ultimately, of the 60 variants, 2 of them were adjusted based on clinical judgment, even though, and that was, they were concordant between the initial reviewers. So for those 2 variants, essentially, they were classified as VUS based on the rule framework as it stood, but review of the data, the initial reviewers as well as in the larger panel, felt that likely pathogenic was a better classification. So in both of these cases, they really only needed one more piece of supporting evidence to call it likely pathogenic. And what we felt was for these variants that they were just not so much that it's not that the rules didn't work, but that there was specific information about each variant that really allowed us to feel more confident in that classification. For the first one, you know, it was only seen in 11 probands, but actually there was quite a few other cases that we ruled out because of our conservative approach, and we didn't want to consider because we couldn't be sure of exactly the phenotype or the that they weren't double counted, and so we took a very conservative approach in that number. And for the second one, it was present primarily in a group, not only just a de novo occurrence, but a phenotype of DCM and myopathy, which for people who are familiar with MYH7 is a pretty specific combination. And so that combined with all the other evidence, the committee just felt that VUS was just not the correct classification for these 2 variants. And applying clinical judgment to classifications is also not a new concept. And our percentages are right in line with what the Amendola paper found in terms of using clinical judgment to adjust the final classification. So it definitely is very fitting and consistent with what has been reported thus far. And so to go through just some of our main conclusions that hopefully you've been able to glean as I've been going through this at this point, is that disease and gene-specific improvements definitely make a difference in the performance and result in higher inter-user concordance. Variant classification is an error-prone process. It is complex. It requires a lot of additional information from a lot of different sources. And ultimately, anything we can do, tools or other processes that can be implemented to really minimize where human error can make a difference, the process is only better for it. And it's just definitely something to kind of keep in mind and consider when there are differences. Also, the unpublished data had a significant impact on rule application and the overall classification, and so we need to continue to work towards finding ways of allowing people to share their data and incorporating that hopefully in structured ways into sources. So ultimately, ideally, everyone is classifying variants off of the same data. That would, you know, that's sort of the dream at this point, but we need to continue to work towards that. And ultimately, as has been known thus far, you know, the guidelines are good, even these adjustments are good, but they're not perfect. And that ultimately we need clinical judgment for how these variants are classified, and you cannot replace that by rules no matter how specific. And so involving clinical experts in variant classifications specific to these areas is still going to be a very important piece to this whole process. And with that, as all of you guys should know, this type of project would not be possible without a vast team of individuals. In particular, I'd like to thank Birgit and Ray, our chairs, as well as sort of our core task team who really helped slog through the bulk of this, as well as the curators who volunteered their time to go through all of these genes, and then the other members of our cardiomyopathy expert panel and our collaborators and the larger members of the cardiovascular domain working group. Their contributions have been just immense, and we could not have done this without them at this point. And with that, I thank you, and I'm sure Birgit and I would be happy to take questions.
That was terrific. Thank you very much, Missy. So does anyone have questions?
I say, Birgit, do you have anything to add either?
You know, I've been thinking about this for 3 years, and I don't think, I mean, I'm so glad we're done. The paper's just been accepted with minor revisions. So, no, I don't have anything to add. That was a great overview.
Hey guys, this is Marina. Great talk. It is a huge effort, and I've only seen the tip of the iceberg of it, but I really applaud you. I was just curious. I know we struggled a little bit in the hearing loss group going through functional assays, and I saw that you guys had taken the very conservative approach, essentially, of just listing animal models as strong. I know in our case, we came up with a couple other assays where we were able to calculate the sensitivity and the specificity and actually just reduce the strength of the evidence, because pretty much anything short of animal models, we agree with you, probably would not be strong. So we ended up with some moderates and some supportings. I was just wondering if you had considered ever downgrading that type of evidence for any other particular assays, as it's quite rare to find an animal model.
Missy, can I take that one?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so you're bringing up an excellent point. And so I think, yes, absolutely, we endorse the concept of assigning reduced weight to other functional assays. Now, I will say that this concept was not yet endorsed when we did that. So the ClinGen's SVI became more active later, and it was then become more clear. It became more clear that you can actually reduce the strength of other rules. So we were operating under the black and white. So there's only the rule that allows strong evidence, and so that we stand by is animal models only. But and then to answer the second question, I'd love to get there, but I think it's quite a challenging process, and I'd be curious how you approached it, because you really need research experts that can help you understand the vast majority of assays that are out there. How did you go about this?
It was difficult. I mean, we did have Heidi and a couple other people who had done particular research in hearing loss and assays, but we kind of just scoured the literature, and it's difficult because even if we had false positives, false negatives, we really didn't have very many benign variants that were published with functional assays, because you just don't get those. So I think that limited a lot. But when we could, we tried to calculate the specificity and the sensitivity using pathogenic.
Yeah. I mean, there were so many assays that we came across in the variants that we looked at. It would have been out of scope at this point in time, but I think this is actually something that the community, the ClinGen community, and maybe broader really needs to address, because I feel that most of us don't have the expertise to, or the resources, right, to find all this data. So, I mean, what we have often is people's qualitative assessment, oh no, you can't trust luciferase assays, or, you know, but beyond that, we didn't go.
Yeah, that makes sense. I agree. We only went with very specific gene ones, such as oocyte assays for GJB2, assays, nothing like luciferase, for example. We just said, if you believe those, downgrade very low to supporting. Way out of scope.
Maybe this is a question for Jenny. Might be closer to the source. Is there any concerted effort within ClinGen, any of the curation core groups, to attack that issue?
The functional assays, I mean, I would think that, you know, SVI is really the place for that. I don't know, is Stephen on the call?
He's out at rotation, so.
Oh, he is. Yeah, I mean, I think we're really looking to SVI to provide this type of guidance within the variant curation groups. Yeah.
And actually, while we're on that topic of mouse models, and Melissa and Birgit, I greatly apologize if you've already brought this up in your talk. I've seen literature evidence / suggestions that, so MYH7 is sometimes referred to as beta myosin heavy chain within the mouse, and MYH6 is apparently alpha myosin heavy chain, and evidently they switch in expression during mouse development. So once postnatal hits, or postnatal day 1, so to speak, apparently alpha myosin heavy chain is the predominant myosin expressed in the mouse heart rather than beta. So in terms of mouse models, were you able to count alpha myosin heavy chain models that were done in the MYH6 gene rather than the MYH7?
That's an excellent and very well-researched point. I don't know, actually, if there is any variant-specific knock-in in the MYH6 gene. I don't think we've come across that, but I'd have to look at the list. I think they were all based on the MYH7 gene. So it's actually an unresolved mystery of this duplicity in the genome, both human and mouse, and what that means. So I unfortunately cannot answer your excellent question.
But I guess, so then I guess a follow-up to that, so MYH6 though would be accepted, so to speak, if the model did get HCM.
I'd have to think about that actually and put it back to the experts. You know, we've actually admittedly not discussed functional data in the context of having 2 paralog genes.
Okay.
And you know, they're actually on the protein level, I believe, nearly identical, which is a conundrum. So but that's something, Missy, that we can bring back to the expert panel. We're actually going to resume our work, and as you all know, these frameworks are never set in stone. We'll have to continue, and you know, this is a good point. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Hi, Birgit. I think this is Courtney. I think great presentation to you, Melissa. But I think the only other question I had was more for how I'm focused this month in explaining, because MYH7 is associated with Lang syndrome, HCM, and DCM. So obviously the syndrome is more of the, C-terminal exons, I think like 38 through the terminal exon. But for HCM and DCM, does that actually change your way you would count functional assays? Would you include a variant that could be associated with both the same way? Or would you choose different functional assays to actually see pathogenicity?
Let me think about that one. So if you're researching the pathogenicity of a variant in the context of myopathy, so the Lang myopathy, I think you will likely look at different assays, and since we didn't really focus on that disease in our efforts, I don't think we've come across that particular one, but I don't think there is a huge amount of overlap between Lang muscular dystrophy, muscular myopathy, and HCM, but Missy, can you jump in?
Yeah, so that's definitely, I don't think, something we really looked at in terms of the functional assays. We're definitely focused more on cardiomyopathy. I think it's challenging because just the full spectrum of what's known for Lang is not, I just don't think we fully know that yet. And so I think, you know, there definitely are reported cases of myopathy with cardiomyopathy, more specifically like DCM than HCM. And so I think it's you know, is that really Lang? Is that something else? I think it's a little, I think unfortunately we just don't have enough case studies yet to really fully understand that full spectrum. And so it's definitely still a challenging question, but something that should be taken into consideration when thinking about the functional studies and what are they showing.
And you know, just to go back to the prior discussion, in the context of our work, we really made a very binary black and white decision. Is it a mouse model that shows HCM or DCM, a variant-specific knock-in? Yes, no. Beyond that, we didn't look at the assay in particular, actually, because it would have been a bottomless pit at that point.
Okay, thank you.
You're asking really tough questions. But good, though.
Missy, this is Christy from UNC. Thanks for your presentation, and hi to Birgit. You guys, it seems, pretty quickly in your process decided to change how the rules are combined. And I was curious your thought process and how you sort of went about deciding how to combine the rules differently.
I apologize if I misrepresented that. We did not change how you would combine rules in terms of the number of moderate, number of strong, number of supporting, that sort of thing. We did change the weight of some of the rules.
Okay.
So, but in terms of how you add them together, we did not adjust that.
Okay, perfect. That sounds like a very daunting process, and that I don't want to go through with my group.
Yeah.
So, okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
And that would be counter.
I think we found that. Sorry, Birgit. Early on, I think there were certain situations where, like, oh, well, yeah, if maybe we adjusted this, and then we're like, who are we to make these adjustments after the committee has already kind of put this out? And so we decided that was one thing that was sort of could not be touched as part of this. And thankfully, in the end, after testing everything, it really did work out.
Great,
yeah.
Thank you.
And there is, I mean, at the beginning of our project, the SVI, the Sequence Variant Interpretation Group, was not yet there. Now they are there and very active, and if there's any, I mean, they're actually working, as my understanding, on reviewing the validity of the weighting scheme that is provided also, but it's more and more being centralized to that body. So all of us disease working groups don't go off on tangents and do something in our little corner. Are you involved in a variant curation efforts? Is that why you're asking the question?
Right. So I have two. I'm working with the TP53 group and CDH1 group.
Wow. Yeah. So I don't know how much, now I'm speaking as the, chair of the cardiovascular domain working group. I've become increasingly aware that not all of the disease-specific working groups there are equally in the know of what the ClinGen processes are and what resources and working groups are at their disposal. So that's probably something that's very close to my heart, because we have 4 different groups within the cardiovascular domain, and I'm constantly educating about the existence of this SVI group, and they're very, very good in being a partner. So I don't know if that's come up in your group.
Yeah, we've been in frequent touch with them, and they've sort of blessed our rules now for pilot testing, so that's where we're at.
Oh, great. All right.
But I agree with you. They are very necessary, and they'll be part of the recommendations for expert panels going forward. So it's going to be pretty much a requirement to work with them, which is good.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe one thing that I wanted to add is a little bit food for thought for all of those on the call that participate in variant curation expert panels. We've just, in the context of our publication, came across an interesting conundrum, and that is you submit your paper, which we did, and we got the reviewers' comments back, and they were all relatively benign, except for one comment, and so the reviewer ended up disagreeing with one of our rule changes. And what do you do there, right? So we, I think the reason I'm bringing that up is that we as a ClinGen community probably want to come to a some sort of a process to even version the rules that apply to the whole framework across diseases, because we went back to SVI and said, what do we do now? And so then that started a whole discussion on that rule, and they had reviewed and approved our rules, but you can never really give 100% thought to every nuance. And so now this was brought up again, but there will be other iterations of these frameworks, and we're all going to be faced with, we just released a set of rules to the community, but then, we're all going to continue to work on them, and we've got to find a way to version our work and release, updates and stuff like that. So more comment than anything else, since I just really thought about all this.
Yeah, Birgit, this is Jenny, and I think that's a really great point, and we have had some of the same discussions regarding gene curation and updates to the SOP, and, you know, how do you let people know this information, and when was a gene curated using whichever version of the SOP, you know, so I think that's a really great point and something that we definitely need to think about moving forward.
Yeah.
So I don't have an answer right now, but yeah, really, really great.
Yeah, and in terms of publishing, it's actually not the typical review process because, you know, a reviewer can disagree, but we had a consensus-driven expert panel decision-making process, and like in our case, a 2/3 majority vote counted, and, you know, I can go back to the room and say, well, sorry, you know, you're just one more voice, and it doesn't matter what you think, actually. But yeah, I mean, they all bring up valid points, and then yeah, it's just how to wrangle this evolving, moving target is really, really hard.
Yeah, yeah. So do you mind me asking, what was the outcome? So you basically responded to say that this was, your rules were approved by the group and that you disagreed with the reviewer. Is that what the resolution was?
Nope.
Oh, no.
It was, so I decided to take that was my knee-jerk reaction. Like, too bad, so sad, you weren't part of the committee, and, you know, our majority overruled you. Like, but then I took it back to SBI and I said, look, you know, let's discuss. And they actually discussed a particular rule again and said, oh, this actually is a deeper issue than we initially appreciated ourselves, and there's a lot more. And then, but then they advised us to argue with the journal to, for now, go with the version we had agreed on, knowing that there are going to be additional changes that are in the work beside that particular rule, and sort of explain to the editor exactly what I said before. There will have to be new releases, and we're just going to note the complexity for now and hope that that's okay, rather than changing based on like one-off, you know, requests.
Yeah. So in that situation, I mean, presumably that rule change could have impacted the interpretation of various variants. So, I mean, do you have plans to go back and recurate any of these? Is that part of your plan?
Yeah, so if any change that will be applied to what we just put into ClinVar will have to result in recuration, absolutely. I mean, the rule I'm talking about is the de novo rule, and luckily there weren't too many variants affected by it. So if we have to go back. Sorry, what was that?
All of the variants had sufficient other evidence to meet their class, so to meet that classification, so that change would not have impacted any of the variants that we had.
So that was, yeah. But conceptually, yes, you know, we would go back, and we're waiting for the final decision now. I'm actually quite curious, and it's fine either way. I mean, if the journal says no, you must do what the reviewer says, then we'll just do it, and we'll change it to whatever the SBI, you know, I mean, it's got probably an interesting process for the journal as well to think through how to manage